So today's revision session is on how did the power of the monarchy and the aristocracy change between 1780 and 1832. The change in this period was relatively minimal, particularly for the aristocracy. The change was slightly more significant for the monarchy. And the reasons for that change can be divided into two. So the first is extra-parliamentary pressure. This guy here is Lord Rockingham, and he was leader of the Whigs in the early 1780s and late 1770s as well. He was the owner of this lovely mansion, which we saw briefly last lesson, which is in Rotherham. And this gives us a sense of the kinds of people who were able to put pressure on Parliament at this time. And the second reason for parliamentary or for change to the power of the monarchy and aristocracy was the French Revolution, which is obviously, we could put that in the category of international pressure, and that was in 1789. So we're going to deal with the chronologically earlier event first, which is extra-parliamentary pressure. So this, as I said, was Lord Rockingham, and he was the leader of the Whigs in the early 1780s. Another significant figure at this time was Edmund Burke. And together, Lord Rockingham and Edmund Burke were part of a very short-lived government of 1782, and when they were able to introduce some changes. But to understand the reasons why they were introducing changes in that 1782 government, we've got to look back a little bit further to 1779. And we need to look at the Yorkshire Association. The Yorkshire Association was founded by this guy here, Christopher Wyville, who was a cleric in the Church of England. And he founded the organisation in response to concerns about government spending and increasing unpopularity of the government as a result of problems with the war in America, with fighting the War of Independence. The war had started in 1775 and would continue until 1783, and George III's determination to win the war had led to increasing taxes. Now, the Yorkshire Association, when it was founded in 1779, wasn't actually arguing against the War of Independence per se, but it targeted other aspects of government spending. They believed that if those aspects of government spending were reduced, that taxation could also be reduced as well. So this was definitely not a reform movement organised by ordinary people. This was a movement that was dominated by people who were a combination of people who were voters or people who were very wealthy but not voters. And the organisation was dominated by members of the gentry. In many ways, it was controlled by Lord Rockingham and other aristocratic Whigs. And the arguments that were put forward were kind of threefold. So the first argument was that the government sinecures and pensions should be reduced in number. I'll just put the definition of sinecure up here to remind you. And the second was that there should be annual parliaments to allow the general population to have a greater influence over the House of Commons, because the feeling was that the monarch had most influence over the House of Commons, and the ordinary people as voters weren't able to influence the House of Commons. And then the final argument was something that was put forward by some members of the association movement, but not everyone. So some members argued for universal suffrage, which was obviously an incredibly radical suggestion for the time, and it was something that Lord Rockingham wasn't supporting, but some members of the association movement did support it. So the association movement was influential because it was made up of people who were mostly voters, and because it was made up of relations of peers, and also supported by some of the peers that were high up in the Whig party. Obviously, we've got to remember that party loyalties at this time were relatively loose. Politicians through their career shifted their loyalty between being an independent MP, and also going kind of over to the other party as well. The aristocrats in the Whig party were more members of the Whigs because of their kind of family and their relations than than anything else. But during the 1780s, Whigs under Rockingham became more and more committed to parliamentary reform, mostly because of their involvement with the Yorkshire Association. So what actually happened then when they got into power? So in 1782, the government of Lord North failed, and Rockingham was put in charge. He only ever had a minority within the House of Commons, so what he could achieve was relatively limited. And when he died later in 1782, obviously the government ended. Now, for our purposes, the most important figure in this government is actually Burke, who is on the right here, because he was made paymaster in Rockingham's government, and that put him in charge of the sinecures and pensions of the crown. So a sinecure, the definition is on here. A pension was a large sum that was paid annually to someone who had performed a impressive service to the crown. Now, George III had massively increased the number of sinecures and pensions that he had at his command. So the influence that George III had over the House of Commons was significantly higher than the influence of his father and his grandfather. In 1780, the Yorkshire Association and an increasing feeling increasing resentment of George III as a result of his struggles in the American War for Independence led to Rockingham, although he was not yet in government, putting forward a number of proposals for reform. And although those proposals weren't accepted, there was a significant success because Rockingham and other Whigs were able to persuade the House of Commons to vote to support a motion that the power of the monarch over the House of Commons was increasing and that the monarch's influence in the House of Commons should be reduced. So the fact that the House of Commons committed to that in 1780 showed that there was a clear appetite for reform in the House of Commons, even though many independent MPs would have supported the monarch. Clearly, there was enough support in the House of Commons to support reforms that would reduce the monarch's influence. And so Burke kind of took advantage of that feeling for reform, took advantage of support outside the House of Commons in the form of the Yorkshire Association. And when he became paymaster in 1782, he set about reforming the sinecures and pensions that the Crown had control over. Now, this he had to do quite carefully, but he was able to pass an act which was called the Civil Services Act, which abolished 130 of the sinecures and pensions that the Crown had control over. And that, as a result of that, the government was able to save £70,000 a year as a result of the abolition of the sinecures and pensions. This was obviously a significant sum and particularly impressive because normally the role of paymaster was used by the person who held that role to enrich themselves. And Burke made sure that practice ended because he put all of the financial powers of the paymaster in the hands of the Bank of England to make sure that future holders of that role would not be able to enrich themselves. So two really important positive changes. So when Rockingham died in 1782, there was a brief a period of chaos, and then Pitt was put in charge by the King. Now, Pitt at that time did not have a majority in the House of Commons, so he had to tread fairly carefully. But he was also able to make changes to the sinecures and pensions in the House of Commons. So Pitt again was responding to the extra-parliamentary pressure of the Yorkshire Association and the other associations that had sprung up in different counties around the country. He was also responding to what he saw as pressure for reform within the House of Commons. He was kind of looking back to the motion of 1780, when the House of Commons had voted to reduce the power or reduce the influence of the king over the House of Commons. And he really wanted to make the House of Commons more independent from royal influence. As I spoke about in the revision session, the first revision session, he tried to introduce moderate change in 1785 by abolishing some of the worst rotten boroughs, but the House of Commons actually voted against that. And that showed the limits of the parliamentary support for reform. And even though the Parliament had voted in principle to reduce the power of the monarchy, they were certainly not ready to reduce the power of the aristocracy. And that is what would have happened if rotten boroughs had been abolished. And obviously a lot of the people in the House of Commons were supported by patrons in the House of Lords, were related to people in the House of Lords. So there was a resistance to that. Pitt felt that he was unable to significantly change the number of sinecures and pensions that were left over after Burke abolished those initial 130. But what he did do was he allowed sinecures and pensions to lapse when the recipient died. So what tended to happen with a pension is that would then be transferred to the family, and Pitt prevented that from happening. And what obviously tended to happen with a sinecure is then the king would choose a new person to hold that sinecure or to hold that office, and that would sort of sustain the king's influence in the House of Commons. But Pitt would allow them to lapse. So that meant that by the time Pitt resigned in 1801, a significant number of sinecures and pensions were no longer in existence, and that obviously meant that the government were making significant savings. However, more importantly than the savings was the influence that this had on the king. So the king continued to exercise deferential power over the House of Commons, because members of the House of Commons, particularly those who were independent, but also those that were loosely connected to parties, continued to see the power of the king as significant, and the kind of symbolic power of the king as significant. So members of the House of Commons would continue to support the king's government. So that deferential power never went away, but the king's direct control over the House of Commons was significantly weakened, because the number of offices and the number of pensions that he had at his disposal, which allowed him to effectively buy the support of members of the Commons, that had been significantly reduced. So, whereas at the beginning of George III's reign, he had increased his power by adding the number of sinecures and pensions that allowed him to influence the House of Commons, a combination of Burke and Pitt removed that. So by 1832, there was still a significant number of sinecures and pensions that the monarch had control over, but that number had reduced significantly. So Burke and Pitt were able to reduce the direct influence of the monarch over the House of Commons. Now, it's worth saying that when the power of the monarch reduced over the House of Commons, and therefore the House of Commons became more independent, actually what happened is that the power of the aristocracy increased in many ways, because nothing was done to reduce the power of the aristocracy. The aristocracy didn't have sinecures and pensions. So when sinecures and pensions were removed, what that left was MPs who were relatively independent. Now, once an MP was more independent, they were free to find an aristocratic patron, or alternatively, they were free to vote with their instincts. And their instincts were to support the landed interest, because all MPs had to come from a landed background because of the property qualification. So when the power of the king over the House of Commons reduced, the power of the aristocracy and the power of the landed class increased. When the House of Commons became more independent, it was better able to represent the interests of the aristocracy and other large landowners. Next, we're going to look at the French Revolution and the impact this had on the power of the monarchy and aristocracy. So make sure you've got a full set of notes on the influence of extra-parliamentary pressure on the power of the monarchy and the power of the aristocracy. In 1789, after calling the Estates General to meet, Louis XVI of France was forced to give up his kind of control over the country when a national constituent assembly was formed by the middle class members of French society. This was the first time that a monarchy had been overthrown and been replaced by a new style of government in Europe. And it was incredibly significant on the way that reformers in Europe thought. The French Revolution had a huge impact on the mindset of reformers in Europe. It created a common language, a common goal, and a sort of blueprint for overthrowing monarchs and creating a more representative government. And so in the long term, this was highly significant. However, in the short term, the impact that the French Revolution had on the British monarchy and aristocracy was relatively limited. And that was in part due to this man, Edmund Burke. Burke's book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, was written just 1 year after the French Revolution. And his book set the tone for the British response, certainly the British establishment's response to the French Revolution. It argued that the French Revolution ignored the complexities of human nature, that humans were essentially selfish beings, and that there needed to be a strong authority and hierarchy in society in order to prevent kind of a dangerous and chaotic society from emerging. So he was arguing, he was pro-monarchy, he was pro-aristocracy, and in his book he was saying periodically that getting rid of those powerful institutions and those inherited institutions would lead to individuals' sort of selfish nature coming out. Now, that was obviously proven right, or people interpreted it as being proven right, when in 1793, the King of France was beheaded, and that was kind of the start of the Terror. And during the Terror, 17,000 people, around 17,000 people, were executed. And this seemed to be Burke's arguments being proven right. The impact that this had on the establishment was more significant because the majority of those who were executed were from a wealthy background. Many of them had been part of the French nobility. So people in the establishment were given the kind of the incentive to be strongly in opposition to the French Revolution, because it seemed that the French Revolution would do away with all forms of authority and would be incredibly dangerous for the landed class. So although we know that the impact of the French Revolution in the long term was highly significant, it kind of empowered the first British radicals, who later went on to have a huge significance over the passing of the Great Reform Act. In the short term, the impact of the French Revolution on the establishment was relatively limited. So in the kind of early 1780s, a group in the Whig Party emerged, which is called Friends of the People. And this is a group of relatively young Whigs who reject Burke's arguments. And they argue that actually gradual and limited reform inspired by the French Revolution could be a really positive thing. However, the majority of the Whig Party sides with Burke, and the Conservative Party also, or the Tory Party at the time, sides with Burke. And then when in 1793 the king is executed and the Terror starts, this seems to kind of prove Burke's point, and Friends of the People as a group within the Whig Party end up breaking up. Therefore, the immediate impact of the French Revolution on Parliament was to actually turn them against reform. So any kind of murmurings in support of reform in the 1780s very quickly went away and were replaced by opposition to the French Revolution and a patriotic commitment to the stability of the British political system. That was particularly the case because war with France started in 1793. So throughout the 1790s and going into the 1800s, the patriotic thing to do was to be pro-monarchy and against France and against the French Revolution. So in the short term, the power of the monarchy and the power of the aristocracy was actually kind of bolstered, supported by the French Revolution, because there was this commitment within the British establishment to ensure that what had happened in France didn't happen in Britain, and there was a rejection of reform. So we've kind of looked at two aspects or two causes of change in this period, 1780 to 1832. The first one, the abolition of sinecures and pensions, had a relatively significant impact on the power of the monarch, making it more difficult for the monarch to exercise direct power over the House of Commons. But the second one, the French Revolution, actually created a greater level of stability and kind of secured the power of the monarch and the aristocracy, because the wealthy people in Britain became convinced that the French Revolution would lead to violence, anarchy, chaos. And so there was this kind of increased commitment to the symbols of authority, which were the crown and the aristocracy. And another reason why reform was even less likely after 1793 is that the kind of varied response to the French Revolution had split the Whigs. Whigs that were anti-revolution and Whigs that kind of saw value in the revolution were split. And that ensured that the Conservatives, the Tory party, was in power from 1783 until 1830. Yeah, 1830. So 50 years of Tory governments as well, and Tories were anti-reform. So hopefully you have your notes on this topic, and that ends this revision session. Thank you, Year 13.